Hi guys, in this video we are going to be talking about webhooks, about how to make your life easier when building and testing webhook-based scenarios. And we are going to be focusing on three topics. The first one will be pretty simple, and I'm sure that many of you, if not majority of you, are aware of this. And that will be about basically reposting an existing payload to your webhook URL. The second one will be about using parse.json module to basically mimic a custom webhooks module. And the third one will be about how to make your life easier when you need to continually test your scenario when it is in production. Keep in mind that in this video, I will be working mainly with our custom webhooks app, which does not require any special authorization or authentication. And I am aware that there are apps out there which are not that easy to work with or test. But I do believe that some of the techniques which you will learn today can be useful even for those scenarios. So let's go. I'm going to switch to Make now, and let's tackle the first problem. So now I'm in Make, and I do see that it had a few successful execution in the past. And now my problem is that I need to test the scenario for whatever reason. And sometimes it's just not that easy to trigger the webhooks in the source app so you can see what's happening here. So you have to help yourself, and you have to trigger the scenario manually. And now the question is how to do this. So if you go to history, so I will just randomly select the last one. Now let's say I want to rerun this execution because I want to test something. So how to do this? So first of all, you will need to open the output of the module, and then you will want to see this, download output bundles. So now you can simply copy this payload which arrived to the webhook, and then you can use another scenario on Make to re-trigger this one. If I go back to diagram here, in the meantime, I can prepare my helper scenario, which will be posting the same payload back to the main one. So in this case, I'm posting to the same URL. I'm doing post method. Body type is raw, content type is JSON, and then I am posting the same request, right? I did copy it before, so if I remove this and paste it back, this is the same payload which originally arrived to the main scenario. And now I can put those two scenarios side by side for better visibility. And now I can trigger this scenario through this scenario as many times as I want. So like this, and like this. And by doing so, I can easily test what is happening down the road in my scenario. All right, so I guess this was the obvious part, which probably a lot of you are using, but it may not be so obvious to newer makers. So let's now look at a trick with our JSON app and how you can use parse.json module to basically mimic the behavior of the webhooks module. So I'm going to go back to Make. So now I'm looking at the scenario which we used for the previous testing, and I'm going to use it again. So I'm going to open one of the past successful executions. So for example, this one. Again, I'm going to retrieve the received payload. So I'm going to copy it. And now I can edit the scenario by adding the JSON app, parse.json module, where I will simply insert the payload, and then I can just clone this module, can test run this module. We will see it's producing the same outputs as the webhook. And now I would have to remap the values. So country ID would be the country ID from the JSON module, country name would be the country name from JSON module, and so on and so forth, right? You get the idea. So instead of having to build a helper scenario triggering the payloads back to the main original ones like we did before, you can simply use this JSON module to parse the retrieved payloads from the past. Sometimes it might be better doing it this way. Sometimes it might be better doing it the other way around. Obviously, when you use the parse.json module, you do have to do some remapping here, which may not be always desirable. But maybe if it's just a few items to map, this is good enough. If you don't want to do any remapping while you test, you can just go for the helper scenario and start posting from the helper scenario the same thing over and over. It's up to you. I'm just throwing it out there that these options exist. And once you are done with your testing, you will just drag and drop the clock back to the webhooks app, and that's it. You can keep this here for testing. You can save the scenario, and the next time you need to test something, just drag it back, you replace the JSON, and then you can keep running the scenario over and over. So let me just test run this scenario. So I'm gonna remove these incorrect mappings for now. And I could be running it over and over. And if I had more modules, I could examine what's happening down the road in the scenario. So again, up to you. Sometimes it's better to build the helper scenario, posting the payload. Sometimes it might be just easier to use this JSON trick, especially when you don't have to remap a lot of things in the subsequent modules. Let's now focus on the third item on my list, and it will be about spending a bit more operations in your scenario in return for better maintainability in future. So we will be getting payloads from a webhook, and then we will be making an extra API call to get all the details about the ID which you just got, so you can use it in the subsequent modules. And I will obviously explain the benefits of doing so. So let me now go back to make again. So here we have the scenario which you know very well, and it's getting this data to a webhook, and then it's outputting this data. It's a simple scenario which doesn't really do anything, but for our purposes, it's good enough. So it's returning the country name, country codes, and country ID. And then we have another scenario, which is the same inputs and outputs, but it is burning a bit more operations. So the scenario is here. So on the input, we get this. And the output, of course, is the same. So the question is, what are these two modules doing here and why are they useful? So let me go to the scenario and let's start looking. So here in this module, I'm basically taking just the country ID coming from that original payload. And then I'm making an extra step of requesting all the possible data about that ID, about that object. And then once I get this data from this HTTP module, I'm gonna map the retrieved data into my final outputs here. So the country ID will be the country ID set in this module, and then the country name and country ISO 2 and country ISO 3 will be mapped from this module. Now, it still may not make much sense to do it this way, but we'll get there. So let me run the scenario again. So now it's running, and we have our obvious output. So far so good, it works, but there are two extra operations. Now, let's say you need to test this scenario and it's in production and you need to be able to test it quickly without spending too much time on it. So what can you do now? Well, thanks to doing these two extra steps, you could do this. You can unlink the webhooks module and you can start running the scenario from this module. And instead of retrieving the actual country ID coming from this module, you can simply set whatever ID you want to test. So let's do 150, for example. And now you can see what the rest of the scenario is doing without too much hassle of creating test submissions, right? Or dealing with JSONs. You can literally trigger the scenario like this. So for country with ID of 150, we see it's New Caledonia. We can try 50 again to make sure it is still Costa Rica. We can try maybe 33 and see how it behaves in the scenario. Bulgaria. And once you are done testing, you can drag the clock back to the webhooks module, link them back, and then replace the country ID or the ID value instead of the hard-coded one. And now your scenario is back to its full strength, back to its production setting within like 20 seconds after you tested everything. And I do realize that this approach will always consume a bit more operations, but consider the benefits you are getting this. You can test this anytime, super easily, without too much hassle. So I would say for scenarios which are very long, for webhooks which are hard to trigger, and for apps where you can actually retrieve the object details, the object attributes by its ID, I would consider doing it this way instead of testing the scenario through JSONs, or instead of like building helper scenarios, pushing payloads back to the webhook module. I personally use this approach a lot. It has proved many times that this approach was just worth it, even though, yeah, every execution will be 2 extra operations. So I hope this trick is useful, at least for some of you. And this is it for working with webhooks. See you in the next video.